Now I'm excited to introduce our host, Dr. Grace Lemmon. Dr. Lemmon researches mindfulness, burnout, and weight-based mistreatment at work. She is an active corporate trainer focusing on stress management, mindful communication, and cultivating a growth mindset. She has published her work in the Academy of Management Journal, Journal of Management, and Organizational Dynamics. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Lemmon.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Carolyn. And I'm going to jump right in here because I know a lot of us have a lot of stuff on our plate causing us stress. So we need to get some immediate relief to some of the demands in our life. So, obviously I'm a professor at DePaul. I'm also an alumni of DePaul. I did my undergraduate there and graduated with the class of 2006. And I've come full circle and I've been a professor at DePaul for about a decade. I teach organizational behavior and leadership topics in the Department of Management in the College of Business. And of course, doing a presentation like this to other students and alumni is near and dear to my heart because of my history with DePaul. So stress. I am going to talk about stress because not only is it something that I teach in my classes as a really important factor in being more effective in your professional roles, it's also something that I deal with a lot in my own life. And I felt that to really resolve and cope with the stress that I had, it was important that I do it in an evidence-based way. So being a professor, evidence-based way means that I'm not just, going to Wikipedia to figure out, how to manage stress, but I'm actually looking at primary research articles that give kind of the best and most esteem-worthy tips to better managing the stress. So I use the skill set I built through my training to try to resolve the stress within me. And I'm going to share with you today the highlights of what I uncovered. So to begin with, what is stress? Stress occurs when we have these resources in our body that are overtaxed. These resources could be our time, our emotional energy, our physical energy, our kind of wakefulness, our attention, any resource, anything that you have that you feel as though fuels you throughout the day is considered a resource. And when your brain believes that you are either going to be overtaxed or actually is overtaxed, that is when stress kicks in. So I want to point out an interesting part of that definition of stress, and that is the anticipation of taxed resources causes stress. And I'm pointing this out because that means that a lot of the stress that we feel is not real. And when I say it's not real, of course, it feels real. We have thoughts and feelings and emotions about the thing that's causing us stress, but it's anticipatory stress. And when we think about stress as being anticipatory, that means that we can work to resolve the stress before it becomes a full-blown stress attack in our lives. And so one of the themes throughout today's presentation is to start to recognize in a mindful way the difference between an actual stressor that is currently taking too much from you and the anticipation of too much being taken from you. If it's the latter, you can cope with it right now with a mindset shift. And I'm bringing this in because I also am a huge researcher and very interested party in mindfulness, not just mindfulness meditation, but mindfulness as a skill set to become better aware of your brain's tendencies, better friends with your brain, a better steward of your brain. And a lot of stress management comes back to mindfulness to be a better steward. I digressed a little bit. So stressed, you're feeling overtaxed in your resources or you anticipate it. And there are two primary consequences. The first is psychological. This means that your brain works overtime to think about because it wants to resolve that stressor. So excessive rumination is a hallmark of a psychological consequence of stress. When you can't stop thinking about the deadline or the kind of weird conversation you had with a friend or the needs of a child that you have, when you think over and over and over about the stressor, the thing that's causing you stress, that's rumination. So it's a very common psychological experience. Why does your brain do this? Why do we ruminate? It's a pretty common question. And speaking of questions, you're welcome to use the chat in Zoom to ask me questions throughout. I'll answer them either within the presentation or at the end. But back to my question, why ruminate? Our brain ruminates because our brain's primary function through evolution is to keep us alive, to procreate and to keep us alive. So our brain has been programmed through the millennia to run, you can think of it like a computer program or computer programs. They constantly spit out information that focus your attention to make sure that you stay alive. And when your brain experiences a stress, which is tapping too many resources or anticipation of tapping of too many resources, your brain feels as though that is a threat to existence. Your brain is dramatic. It's actually another presentation I do kind of on the history of the brain and how it developed to be so dramatic. But in a nutshell, your brain is very dramatic about stressors because it's concerned about dying. It's concerned about existence. And because of this, it can't let go of things. It feels like if there's a stressor, you have an ailing parent. It's a stressor in your life, even though you've kind of just dealt with that situation, you'll loop around it over and over and over again because your brain anticipates you're going to spend too much focus here, too much attention here, and you're not going to pay attention to your environment and you might perish as a result. So what is this telling you broadly? This is telling you your brain is dramatic, it's going to ruminate a lot, and there's not much you can do about it. You can try to break the pattern, and we'll talk about breaking the pattern in a little bit, but you're not a bad person for ruminating. You're not doing anything wrong. Your brain has been programmed that way. So these psychological components of stress, they're normal and they're natural. Physiological outcomes. When you are stressed, you have a somatic reaction. So in your body, you will feel the reaction to stress. It can be a tightening of the chest, a tightening of the jaw, a dull headache. You can feel sweaty, you can feel clammy, you can feel extremely fatigued. We've all experienced these sensations associated with stress. And I have to say that when you really think about it, it's a rather bizarre thing. So let's say I'm feeling anticipatory stress about an upcoming deadline. So the thing is not even bearing down on me yet. I anticipate being stressed, but the deadline isn't here yet. I can still work on the project, but I'm anticipating stress. And as a result of that thought in my brain, my body is releasing all sorts of hormones and activating all sorts of systems. And I'm having this physical reaction to the stressor. You might ask, body, why do you have to treat me like this? Again, it's your brain telling your body to gear itself up to cope with the stressor because you need to cope with it, because if you don't, you're going to burn yourself out and you might die, you might perish, you might, because of concerns about existence, it might go away. So these physiological reactions, much like rumination reactions, are completely normal. They are an adaptive program that your brain has run because it has been trained through the millennia to react like that to stressors. So don't beat yourself up if you have these physical reactions. They're very normal, just your brain's way of getting your attention. Okay, so a couple other things we need to establish about stress before we get to fixing it. Number one, the relationship between a stressor, like a deadline, so a thing that causes you stress is a stressor, and the experience of physiological and psychological harm, so the rumination or the tightness of the chest, that's not a one-to-one relationship. And it's very individual. So how me versus Marshall versus Stephanie versus Carol, how we react to a deadline is all very, very unique. And because it's unique, that gives us some information and some space to figure out, well, why is it that Marshall's so chill about the deadline and Grace is so wound up? And when we figure out what are the differences between those two situations, we can start to come to a better understanding of how to cope with stress, because some people obviously do have better skills. So what are those skills? And we're going to talk about those, don't worry. So why should you cope with your stress rather than just letting it crash into you like wave after wave after wave? Number one, lots of really cool long-term studies of people who experience chronic stress and don't put in place any action plans or intentions to cope with their stress and negative repercussions on their body. You might ask, okay, so what is that? Like, what is the mechanism there? Why is this like rumination that I'm having? Why is it causing a long-term health consequence? I'm not sure that makes sense. Well, When your body has that physiological reaction, let's say it releases adrenaline, which is kind of gearing you up and making you hyper-focused, it's speeding up your heart rate, it's opening up your arteries, it's turning online some emergency systems in your body is shunting resources to that kind of emergency response, and there's an opportunity cost. Your body is therefore not devoting resources to housekeeping tasks. And the type of housekeeping tasks, the maintenance that you do on this vehicle of your body that keeps it running, that keeps it from not breaking down, that keeps it from not being sick. So proper cellular turnover in your heart, in your muscles, in your bone is contingent upon housekeeping processes that your body needs to go through. But if your body is devoting resources to stress, it's not doing the housekeeping, it's not doing that vehicular maintenance, and breakdowns will occur. So that's why the researchers anticipate that stress over time it accumulates over time and can be such a burden on your physiological system. So people have cardiovascular, metabolic, muscular and skeletal issues. All sorts of organs are impacted. Cancer rates are impacted. Earlier death occurs for people who have chronic unresolved stress. So pay attention, I guess, is the motto here. At work, you are less effective at decision-making when you're stressed, because when we're stressed, our focus is so constrained on the thing causing us to feel that way, because, feeling rumination is not great. Feeling a tight chest, it's not a good sensation. And we're so hyper-focused on that, rightfully so, that we don't see the big picture. We don't see all the options. There's no room for creativity. And so we end up making much more short-sighted decisions at work and personally as well when we feel chronic stress. And as a result, organizations who have employees who are chronically stressed report lower performance, more absenteeism, more higher rates of turnover. That's why organizations, I think somewhat ironically, are so obsessed with stress, even though they're the ones oftentimes who are creating the stress. They also have a lot of programs and plans in place to deal with stress, because it is so costly to the workforce. So what are we doing today? I'm getting down to it. 2 ways that you can start to cope with your stress. Number one big way is some more self-awareness around the stress in your life. And the second way is, I hit the wall. Self-awareness took me to a place from being wild with stress to modestly wild with stress. And I needed more. I wanted more equanimity in my life. And so I had to go to the second step, which is stopping the pendulum of stress in my life. So self-awareness step number 1. You have to figure out, as I mentioned before, what is your own tendency or propensity to take stressors in your environment, like a minor car accident, a missed deadline, arriving late to work, a colleague not doing their work as they should. What is your propensity to turn those very common, very normal, very regular stressors into your life into that feeling of strain, of, as my husband likes to call it, of going into your stress nook? So how likely is that for you? And for some personality traits, it is much more likely. And if you know this about yourself, you can be more proactive in coping with your stress. So one personality type that tends to feel more stress are people who have type A or perfectionist tendencies. So type A means you want to control everything. You feel as though if you control everything, then life will be easier for it. It's usually the opposite. If you don't control everything, you delegate, essentially. And when you delegate, you have fewer things on your plate. And so it's less stressful because there are less demands. But people with type A personality are not willing to be that vulnerable and to rely upon other people to do the task, the job, whatever, as well as they would do it. And so they don't cede control and they easily become overwhelmed as a result. Perfectionists, similarly, really like to focus on work and their expectations of themselves, not of other people. It's really about themselves. Their expectations of themselves are extraordinarily high and unrealistic. And so they tend to accumulate stress because the standards they set for themselves are too high and they're too demanding and too taxing. And that's the basic definition of stress. And so perfectionists are more likely to feel it. So we're going to talk about resolution in a minute, but those two types, they have hyper control issues where they need to control everything in order to feel on top of it. But of course, when you're controlling everything, that's too much on your plate. There's also the flip side. There are people who have something called an external locus of control, and they have this almost learned helplessness. And the learned helplessness is no matter what I do, life is overwhelming. No matter what I do, I have too much on my plate. So I'm kind of unwilling to lean into coping with my stressors. I just let the waves smack me across the face. I don't actually try to do anything about it. And the learned helplessness is interesting because it's not correlated with people who have less aptitude or less effort. It's correlated with people who are burned out because you just don't feel like you have the wherewithal within you to cope with stressors anymore. So I call this hypo control. Like you feel as though you control less than you actually can in your life, which accumulates stress. And then the third area that can heighten your stress response is if you have a lot of past experience with kind of traumatic stress, especially in the workplace. We don't talk about this a lot, but maybe you've had a boss or you've had a job or you've been in an employment situation where the stress was so acute and overbearing that you felt in danger. Your mental health, maybe even your physical health felt in danger. Maybe you had a particularly cruel boss where you constantly felt harassed or bullied or threatened in some way. And when you experience that, especially in a professional context where it's not expected, your efficacy for managing stress plummets because you can't cope with this, usually like a narcissist or a group of narcissists in your professional life who have, are undercutting you in some fashion. And so you lose your confidence in your ability to attempt to cope because you've had this traumatic professional experience. Okay, so what can you do? If you fall in one of these three categories, I know I've fallen actually in all three of them at certain points in my professional career. What can you do? Number one, to really sit down and I say productively meditate. So you're really focusing on this issue of where do I have reasonable control over my life, in my professional life, in my personal life, and where do I need to accept I don't have control? 2 columns. 2-column piece of paper. What do I not control? What do I control? List it out for yourself. And then when your brain starts to tell you stories about the other column, trying to control something that you can't, or telling you that you can't control something that you actually can, refer to these 2 columns that have objective information about what is possible. Again, our brain's trying to dramatize. And just because you have a thought doesn't make it true. And so you have to realize that when it comes to stress, there's an added layer of fiction in your brain because your brain is hyper-controlled about resolving the stressor to stay alive. And so the number of fictitious fake storylines in your head about what you can and cannot control is going to be sky high if you have these tendencies. So it's very good to objectively write down what you do and do not control and refer to it if you feel like your brain is a runaway train of hyper or hypo control. Then I also wanted to plug, if you've been through a professionally challenging experience, a project, a boss, a coworker, etc., you need to address this trauma. Don't just leave it behind. Just because it happened at work rather than in your personal life doesn't make that incivility or that trauma any less meaningful. So think through it with a professional, think through it with a trusted loved one, address that trauma and realize that, you are not that trauma, you are not that experience, and you've grown and developed from it, and do your best to move on from it. All right, so this is number one, self-awareness about your own personality. Step number 2 of self-awareness, you have to collect and analyze some data on yourself. The data that you're collecting is really about figuring out what type of stressors you have in your life and then categorizing them based on how helpful or not helpful they are. You may have just had a record scratch when I said stressors could be helpful. They can actually be helpful. Stressors are things that tax or anticipate taxing your resources, and this is the genesis of growth. This is the genesis of learning. When you experience something that's new and novel, when you have a new task, when you have a new boss, when you have a new partner, whatever it may be, you are challenged by that situation because of the novelty, because of the complexity, because you don't exactly know how to react and respond and relate to this thing, right? This is a challenge stressor is how we would frame it. And the beautiful thing about challenge stressors, although they do tax you, you learn more about yourself, the world, your skills, other people, relationships, etc. The learning opportunity is immense when you challenge yourself the right amount, when you stress yourself the right amount. And so there are some things in your life, personal or professional, that probably have this challenge stressor aspect to them. Common ones are reasonable time pressure to complete a task or a deadline, getting a work assignment that is more complex than you are accustomed to, increasing your scope or expand of responsibility at work. These are all stressors that can be good because you can grow and mature from them. Unfortunately, a lot of us have a hard time seeing stressors and these challenge stressors as good things because we're overwhelmed with this other category, hindrance stressors. These are things that just take. So challenge stressors give and take. There's a flow of give and take with the thing itself. Hindrance stressors take. For example, role conflict. You're at work, you have different responsibilities that seem to conflict with one another, and you have different stakeholders who want different things from you. And so that conflict, it just drains you. There's no resolution to it. There's no growth opportunity there, really. It's just you have people who aren't communicating above you, giving you conflicting assignments. And so that's really, really hard to cope with. Role ambiguity. You don't know what your job's supposed to be. You get mixed messages about what your role is supposed to be. You simply are overloaded. The number of things relative to the time that you can invest in work, it's out of whack, it's out of proportion. And just the daily hassles, uncommunicative coworkers, a computer that doesn't respond, Zoom features that update and change, all these things that just kind of like nibble away at your kind of tolerance in your day-to-day life, your ability to find peace in your day-to-day life. And so a lot of us are so, our laundry list of hindrance stressors is long, and our list of challenge stressors is small or very small. And when we look at this, it can make our stomach flip just a little bit because we realize that the hindrance stressors are blocking. They're a block in our path to find the time, the slack, the energy to focus on our challenge stressors. And so one of the points of this exercise is to really motivate you once you've listed out those hindrance stressors, those things that are inhibiting your goal progress, attack. Because until you start to check those off, you're not going to be able to go to those challenge stressors with the amount of kind of vim and vigor that you need for them to be exciting and for you to enjoy the process of the challenge. Of course, you can do this exercise in your personal life as well. We all have hindrance and challenge stressors in our personal life. And same idea here, minimize your hindrance stressors so you can lean into your challenge stressors. All right, next up, these are more micro level strategies for managing your stress based on kind of evidence-based research. The first one is just you got your day-to-day task flow. Start organizing incoming tasks, incoming demands based upon the Eisenhower matrix, which differentiates between tasks that are urgent versus non-urgent, important versus not important. What most of us find that our time, other than the urgent and important stuff that they're like emergencies, we can't ignore them. What we tend to do is after the urgent, important stuff is out the door, we focus on what appears to be urgent but not important stuff. So a lot of the emails that you receive, calls, some meetings that you attend, reports that you drop that nobody reads, all of these things really take your attention away from what I would say is the more important quadrant, stuff that's important to you, and they slowly drain your life force, okay? And this is called shallow work. Some people call this shallow work, where it feels good. Like I have my inbox right now. I probably have 10 emails in my inbox. And when I'm off this call, I've got a little gap between now and my next meeting. I'm going to go through my inbox, respond, and get it done. And if I really think about it, is that a good use of that time? None of those emails were really that important. They could have all waited for tomorrow. I could have done something that was more meaningful and valuable to me other than a clean inbox. And so what am I talking about? Meaningful work. This is stuff that is important to you, that aligns with your values, that aligns with goals that you've set with yourself, that requires deep thinking, cognitive, deep thinking, that allows that allows for challenge. This is where the challenge stressors typically come in. They're important to you. It may not feel urgent, but if you don't get started, you're not going to work toward meeting that challenge. So managing stress means that kind of shifting away from shallow work and moving into deep work so that you get a burst of motivation from intrinsic interest in the ideas, intrinsic motivation in the tasks, rather than just relying on, oh, my inbox is clear. That feels so good. It's a little bit of a bell rings and you eat a carrot type of trick. Another thing you can do is, you hear this so often, but I would not be an org behavior professor if I didn't mention, it has to do with goals. Writing out your goals for the day, for the week, for the month, for the year, whatever time frame feels appropriate. I recommend all of them and linking them together. The thing about goals is that when you have the goals for the day, it reduces your decision making. So you're finished with one goal, you check it off, and you don't have to sit and think, not only what am I going to do next, you don't have to sit and think and ruminate about all the stuff that you could be doing or you should be doing, etc. It gives your brain less time for some of its ruminative reflection if it knows, okay, I checked this goal off, I know exactly where to go next. Not only that, because you can quickly make decisions about what to do next based upon those goals, it's easier to get into a state of flow. So flow is when you start working at 10 a.m., you're working. You look up at the clock and it's 3 p.m. and you're like, where do those 5 hours go? That's flow. The mechanism in your brain that keeps track of time actually down regulates when you are in that flow state. So you're more productive in a flow state, and it's easier to get there when you have these goals that allow you to move seamlessly from one task to the next. And then always, if something is really important that needs to get done, even though it's not a meeting, time block it. Put it in your calendar, 3 to 5 p.m. I'm working on this report. 9 to noon, I'm doing my deep dive, strategizing for the upcoming executive meeting, whatever it may be. Put stuff in your calendar, block it off. This important, non-urgent stuff, it is more important than the meetings, than a lot of the meetings in your calendar. So give it the time that it deserves. And then another strategy, I'll touch on this again, but I'll give it a brief shout out now, is that to manage stress means at its core, you have to manage perceptions of resources, okay? Actual or real, or that's the same thing, actual or perceived resources. And so you need to restore those resources. And there really is only one way to restore a lack of energy, a lack of focus, a lack of attention, a lack of emotional reserve, etc. And that's recovery. Work recovery, sometimes personal life recovery. This is engaging in a high quality activity outside of the demands of your goals, the demands of your work, sometimes the demands of your family life as well. That recovery means your brain is getting a true chance to rest, relax, and recuperate. And that recovery time is so important because your brain's never not working. So when you are recovering, when you are resting it, your brain is doing all sorts of housekeeping as it pertains to consolidating information that you've learned, knitting it together, putting it into the existing infrastructure of memories, of facts that you have, of schema that you have about the world. Your brain is perpetually in a cycle of taking in information and then deciding, do I forget it, toss it away, or do I move it from short-term memory into long-term memory? If you don't give your brain work recovery time, stuff in your short-term memory that you kind of picked up throughout the day will not get translated. I'm pointing because they're back in your brain. The mechanism's back in your brain. Short-term stuff won't get put into the long-term repository. And so you're actually doing yourself sometimes a disservice going through your day at a breakneck pace and not kind of sinking into the process and not giving yourself recovery, because for all that flurry of energy, you're not actually retaining what you learn. Okay, so that was part one. And those stress techniques got me to like a somewhat better place, the self-awareness of my personality. And yeah, I have good and, challenge stressors and hindrance stressors. And let me work on the hindrance ones and let me time block myself. But I still felt like overwhelmed at the end of the day. I still feel like there was just still too much to do that no amount of goal setting or to-do lists were going to help me accomplish. And so I decided to kind of brainstorm with a friend of mine named Jen Golden. Both of us were experiencing why are we still overwhelmed despite, having kind of all the context we would need to not feel overwhelmed? And we decided that it has to do with what we coined the pendulum of stress that we are perpetually on. The pendulum of stress is really common in people who are kind of high aptitude and high achieving, people who constantly put themselves in situations that could incorporate a lot of challenge stressors, a lot of growth experiences in their life. And because, spoiler alert, they don't give themselves enough recovery time, their brain checks out. And when your brain checks out, it has some pretty nasty repercussions. So let me get right into this pendulum of stress, which is, this is a wild slide. I fully recognize it. I'm going to go over it because it is so important. I want us to start over here, this green circle where it says extreme stress. Extreme stress accumulates in a lot of us because we take on a lot. Not only do we take on a lot, we do it with this mindset of I can do it all, or I'm a perfectionist, or I'm type A, or I was raised with, bootstraps mentality, or we have a lot of social comparison concern, or we're part of a cohort and we feel pressure from our cohort. There's so many reasons embedded in our work culture, in American culture, in our family culture, in our own kind of self-understanding of who we want to be. There's so many factors that breed into the starting place where we start in a place of extreme taxing demands on our brain and our body. We just have so much going on. And you know what? As the next step here alludes to, it feels really good in the beginning when we have all these demands and we're juggling all the balls. We're like, actually, yes, we can do it all. Or actually, yes, I'm a perfectionist and I'm proud of it because it's going well. Or actually, yes, I am, the highest performer I can be and more. And so we have this honeymoon period of actually doing it all. Except it's not sustainable because when we overtax ourselves for so long, it becomes too much for our brain. And our brain, and spoiler alert, is going to start fighting back. So we'll juggle the balls. We'll have to kind of white knuckle through a little bit of the juggling because it's getting harder and harder. And eventually we snap. And we feel exhausted, burned out. Sometimes we feel miserable. We feel depressed. We feel anxiety. We feel really disenchanted. We feel irritable. We feel angry. We feel absolutely spent, but not in a I went through a long hike and now I feel refreshed and tired way. We're in a bitter. We're bitter because we were doing it all and we were juggling, and then the ball started to drop and things are going to, go into pot. And what we land on when we're exhausted and we're burned out from the stress is not the place where we should be, which is recovery, where we take some time for true, authentic rest, restoration, focus on our well-being, and all the activities that bring us that sense of kind of joy and gratefulness in a context of slowing down. We don't do that, not in this culture. And actually, it's not possible for us to do that because we're on this pendulum of extreme stress. Our brain now runs all of these programs. So this is not your doing consciously. Your brain is running these programs that makes you disconnect from your life, that makes you want to, and sometimes actually check out from reality. And I call this sloth, the bad sloth-like behavior, where you feel you don't want to be around other people. You don't want to do anything that's going to create, use, one cell in your brain. You're apathetic toward your job. Examples from my own life. I will watch endless Netflix, Hulu, Peacock, Amazon Prime. Okay, there's so many video services that should give you a clue how I check out. So I watch, TV shows, not a few, not an enjoyable few, but just endlessly. And I'm on this, I'm on this dopamine rush, searching for the new perfect show that's going to transport me away from my life. That's what checking out feels like. You want to be transported away from your life. I don't have any zest for personal projects. I might overindulge in eating or alcohol, or I get really irritable with loved ones. I don't want to develop myself in any way. I don't want to connect with other human beings in a way that brings any sort of pleasure or any refreshment to the relationship. Even my work tasks, I'll say, forget you to my inbox. I'll screen my calls. I won't respond to my mother's texts or my friends' texts. Stuff will get overdue, stuff piles up, etc. And so I'm mentioning this low state of total disconnection because I don't think we talk about it, right? We talk about feeling burned out, but we don't talk about the behavior that goes along with that burned out. It's almost shameful, I think, for some of us to cop to what it looks like, what that disconnection looks like. And in the beginning, when you disconnect, it feels so good. Like that first couple hours of Netflix and, overindulging a little bit and ignoring my phone, it feels so restorative and good. And it was needed, right, for one thing, but then it continues on because our brain is like, dang, this feels really good to disconnect. And then it starts craving the disconnection. It starts craving the checking out, even when you don't need to do it anymore because your coffers have been filled. So in the beginning, we can't ignore that it feels really good to disconnect, but pretty soon we feel guilt. We feel shame. We feel like, my colleague over there is not disconnecting, because you don't really know. They probably are, but we assume my colleagues aren't disconnecting, or all those fancy people on LinkedIn aren't disconnecting, or my classmates aren't disconnecting. And we start to internalize guilt and shame for our checking out behavior, for our disconnected behavior. And we decide, okay, I need a fresh start. I want a new phone, a new productivity scheme. I want a new way to organize my to-do lists. I want to join an accountability group, whatever it may be. On Monday, I am going to start doing it all again. And then the cycle begins again, because there really is no productivity app or phone that's going to get you off this pendulum cycle. You have to completely step away from overloading yourself. You have to step away from being proud of doing it all, being proud of being a perfectionist. You have to step away from being proud of having a too full plate. We wear busyness like it's a status symbol in our culture. And the problem with that is it's just smoke and mirrors, because your brain will rebel against you at some point. So I used to have, I'll go over this. So I used to have this slide. I was worried about length, and it talked about dieting behavior. So purposeful restriction of calories. So in the beginning, you purposely restrict your calories, and it feels, a couple days into the diet, it's feeling great. A couple weeks into the diet, it's like, what the heck did I get myself into? And your brain's sending all of these messages to, eat, or move less, or eat this, not, the alfalfa that you're only supposed to be subsisting on. And pretty soon your brain says, I can't do this anymore. You're threatening me too much. And you experience burnout from the diet backlash, and you disconnect. And typically, when you disconnect, there's a lot of studies that when you're on a diet, the thing most correlated with dieting is not weight loss, it's binge eating. And it's your brain saying, whoa, like you were way too far in this extreme of caloric restriction. We're going in this other extreme direction to protect you. And so that disconnection is the overeating in the dieting context. And it feels awesome in the beginning to overeat when you've been on a diet. I've done it 1,000 times. I know it. But then pretty soon you start to feel guilt and shame about your behavior. Oh, I shouldn't have eaten all that I ate. I shouldn't have eaten sugar or gluten or whatever it is you're cutting out. And that guilt eats away from you when you decide on Monday, it's time for keto. It's time for CrossFit. It's time for whatever the heck else they're selling these days. And the cycle starts anew. So the takeaway lesson here is twofold. Number one, your brain and your body will fight back against you if you overtax it, not just in the dieting context, but in the stress context. And so you can't hang on to extreme stress for that long. And number two, when your brain fights back, pendulums rely on momentum, right? You're not going to just land in the middle where your stress becomes moderate. You are setting yourself up for disconnection when you take on too much. And that disconnection, it's not a great place for your own psyche. So you want to get out of it. Where do you want to be instead? You want to be in the center, okay? You want to lovingly shove some stuff off of your plate to bring your number of hindrance stressors down so that you can find eustress. It's called eustress. This is where they find that performance is actually at its best. So humans perform at their best when they're challenged in a way that they think is within their reach maybe just beyond it or just before their limits, but that's when you get best performance out of yourself, is when something is a reach, but it's not beyond. That's when your attention, your focus, your energy, your intrinsic motivation are at its highest. And obviously you can't be there if you're on the pendulum of stress. So here we go. Let's start recognizing where you are at. To do this, we can look at low stress, medium stress, and high stress behaviors. So if you're in a state of low stress, you would think this is a good thing, but remember, it's not. This is when it kind of can be checking out a little bit, when you're not challenging yourself enough. So when you do stuff that only makes you feel really good in the short term, it's probably a checking out low stress state, like procrastinating or overeating, if we were talking about food behaviors. If you're in a high stress state, you tend to take on things that are high visibility. They're going to make you feel perfect. They're going to allow you to keep your brand identity of perfect and do it all. Your calendar is probably extremely full, overfull, some would say, if you're at a point of high stress and you have a lot of difficulty saying no. If you find yourself at the high stress or low stress point, you're on the pendulum and you need to come to the middle. The middle means you're pursuing an array of tasks that make you feel balanced, that make you feel like your personal and professional values are being taken into account. You have time to work on projects that are deeply meaningful. You have time to be present and actively listening to those you engage with, for gratitude, for mindfulness, for that stuff that replenishes your coffers. If you're in a low stress state, you tend to have this attitude of, I deserve this. I deserve this Netflix binge, right? Which is, in some ways, yes, you deserve recovery, just not that kind of recovery. Again, not knocking Netflix. I definitely still watch Netflix. It's just the attitude matters. Are you doing it to escape from life? Or are you doing it as a way to just kind of gently rest for a while? The former is problematic. People who are in a high stress state, they tend to feel like, oh my gosh, this feels great. Look at all that I'm doing. And they're like, oh my gosh, this feels horrible. What have I done to myself? Wait, oh my gosh, this feels great. What am I doing? Oh, so they go back and forth in the emotions of this works and this doesn't work. Medium stress, you have to get to a place where you're like, oh, this is meaningful. Work is meaningful. When you're in a state of low stress, you don't prioritize anything. When you're in a high stress state, everything feels like a fire. These two don't work. They're the pendulum. You want the middle. You have generous time for tasks that are due. You give yourself slack. If you're in a low stress state, you need to avoid wallowing there, because part of your brain stays there because it feels good. Okay, we check out, we binge because it feels good. We can't ignore the reward. So you can't wallow there, or you're going to lose sight of your values in life. And you have to make sure, if you're in a state of high stress, you don't ride yourself down to that low stress state. What will you miss out on? If you stay in a state of low stress, you will miss out on pursuing values and goals that are important to you, because you're going to be kind of in one day and out the other day. In one day, out the other day. Same if you're high stress. You'll have streaks of high productivity followed by streaks of like, where did Grace go? Why isn't she responding to her emails? Like, you'll confuse people essentially if you remain on this pendulum. And let's be frank, if you're at a medium stress level where you're like, life is reasonable, you have to give up some status of being the one who does it all, of being the one who does so busy. And not everyone is ready for that. Okay, so I would love in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, I know this is personal, but can you talk a little bit about what does your pendulum look like? When you're at a state of high stress, what does that look like for you? What are you thinking? What are you doing? When you're in that low state, the pendulum, when you're disconnected, when you're the bad sloth, as I call it, what does that look like for you? What are some attitudes, behaviors, thoughts? What's going on for you? I know this is really personal, so you can just chat you can just chat to me if you want. Yep, giving it up. Someone wrote to me, when I'm at the high stress state, I feel like I don't have a moment to myself. Yeah, you feel like you don't have like a couple minutes to do some deep breathing. That's definitely a high stress state. Can Kathy, high stress state, yeah, more and more time working. And the insidious thing, Kathy, is that when you're in a high stress state, you kind of acclimate to it. You're like, okay, this is the new normal. I can do it. Then the screw tightens a little bit the next day. Okay, this is the new normal. I can do it. It tightens a little bit more. And so after a while, I hate this metaphor, it's the boiling frog. You don't realize that, man, the pot has gotten really hot and it's hurting me. Working all the time, your time is taken up. High stress, always someone or something to take care of. So you feel like, where are you in this conversation? Because you're taking care of everybody else. Low stress, get nothing done. You feel lethargic, you get tired. It's kind of like when you're in this disconnected state, you come into it with low energy. And you're like, yeah, I'm going to spend the day, being a bad sloth, and I'm going to feel great tomorrow. But that's not what happens. Like, your coffers aren't actually restored by checking out. Somebody replying, Sharana replying here, and I feel like I'm not enough, that I need to escape, that the energy is like, I don't want to kind of, this sounds horrible and existential, but I don't want to be like in this body or this mind or this brain right now. Like you want to check out of reality. Low stress, escaping with traveling plans. And okay, planning stuff pragmatically is good. But just living in, here's one that comes up commonly for myself and for others, fantasy land. Some people, when they're in that low disconnected state, they go into a dream fantasy land. That's not like I can get there one day, bringing me pleasant memories or pleasant ideas, but an alternate reality where you're not living your life and everything is different. And it feels kind of crushing when you come back and realize the fantasy is not yours. It's a pretty good indication of disconnection. Okay, so I would point of this presentation, one of the major points is recognize if you're on the pendulum, recognize signs of both columns, and realize you need to come to that medium stress state. Otherwise, you'll always be oscillating and you'll never be your fullest self. You'll never be your most authentic self, because you're either really pulling away from life or you're leaning in too hard. Okay, so how do you get there in our last couple minutes here? I say habits, and there are a couple of key habits you can put in place. Number one, the habit of saying no. And this means somebody asks something of you, you have to hesitate. You have to, I need a minute, I need 5 minutes, I need 5 days. I need some time to think before I commit. And that moment of pause will allow you to develop the ability and the courage that sometimes is required for you to say no. If you look at the balance of hindrance and challenge stressors in your life, when you look at where you are at on the pendulum and you decide that it's not a priority for you right now, given the demands of all the other stakeholders in your life, the opportunity cost is too high. So that's one habit. Another one is the habit of appropriate and meaningful time for recovery. So I've talked about this a little bit. What is recovery if not disconnection? It is spending time on things that make your brain hum, that make your brain feel just kind of pleasant. So it can be knitting, it can be sitting outside with a loved one, it can be gardening, it can be reading a engaging book, romance or a fantasy or a kid's book, whatever it may be, drawing. It's not always a hobby, but oftentimes meaningful recovery is hobby oriented, or it's oriented toward people who always are supportive of you and not draining of you. It can be time practicing mindfulness. Recovery time clearly gives back. Checking out does not give back. And it's obvious. It doesn't give back, but we don't want to always acknowledge it. But nonetheless, you want to make sure you get to a place where you have time for that recovery. Moderate stress also means carving out time for deep work. This is work that is meaningful to you on a personal level. It aligns with values that you have. Putting time on the calendar. If you don't have time for a deep work, it's a clear indication you're at a high point on your stress and you need to dial it back. And then finally, compassion. The habit of compassion means giving yourself the dang benefit of the doubt. Getting over and getting through the pendulum of stress is life's work, because your brain will constantly seek out the status of doing it all. And your brain will constantly feel overwhelmed when you actually are doing it all and you've overextended yourself. And so just the way that your brain is programmed is that it's programmed to be on your pendulum, and it takes a lot of intentionality and practice to find yourself in the center. So have compassion, because the settled pendulum is not your brain's default state. Unless you really trained it well and been very intentional, it's going to take a lot of time for the swinging to settle and for you to find yourself in that center place. So have compassion as you work through that process, because your brain won't do it automatically. Always be asking yourself, if you're on the pendulum, what is the kindest thing I can do for myself? And it's a great place to start. So I want to just conclude here and then answer a couple of questions. Stress is natural and inevitable. Again, our brain wants us to pay attention to stressors because it thinks if it resolves them, it protects resources, which allows us to continue to live. So if you're feeling stressed, that is good. Your brain is healthy. What you need to do is be intentional about what stressors you allow to kind of persist within you, because life is more interesting and engaging when we have moderate amounts of stress. But life can also be overwhelming if we don't keep it at that moderate level. Stay off the pendulum by being very intentional and aware of it, and experiment with some of the strategies I provided to find your sweet spot. So I'm going to pause here and just kind of, there were a few questions in here. Somebody asked if the slides will be distributed. I'm going to let Carolyn answer that one for us. Somebody asked, what is your monthly goal tracker app? So I personally just use Notes, like Apple Notes, where I kind of keep track of my goals. So I keep it very simple. I've had more complicated stuff, but I've never been able to keep up with it. And then I felt guilty about it. And then it just, it was stupid. So I came up with the very basic note style situation. Somebody asked me what to do if your boss is the one causing you stress. So the number one thing I can do, say if your boss is the biggest cause of your stressor, is accept. It's not your responsibility to change your boss. The only responsibility you have is to be a better steward of your brain and how you react to your boss, and realize that the stress that your boss brings upon you says a lot. It says a lot about them, and it says not very much about you. And sometimes just accepting that your boss is a stressful person can take away some of the venom, because you realize you're not the problem. So that's one thing. Another thing is to be crystal clear with your boss about what you can and cannot do given kind of your working hours and your priorities. So I think a lot of boss related stress comes from bosses who give too much, or are very unclear about their expectations, or unclear about the amount of tasks kind of coming down. So parroting back what is requested of you and being crystal clear about what your role is becomes exceedingly important, because what you want to try to do is start to manage yourself. If your boss is not going to manage you by giving you kind of direction and purpose and delineating expectations very clearly, you can do that for yourself, and you can kind of carbon copy your boss on that. So it's another thing you can do. And then the third thing you can do if you have a stressful boss is make sure that in the course of the relationship, you don't put yourself in the role of having to fix your boss. It's not your responsibility to fix your boss if they are stress inducing. Have compassion for them. They are a person who stresses other people out. How awful is it in life to be that person, right? And so you can have a little like smile to yourself and a little compassion because they have a type of personality that it makes other people feel somewhat uncomfortable. So you can have compassion for them, and it helps you be a little more accepting of how they are. Okay, so if there are any other questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat. The recording is going to be posted. Carolyn has some information about that. I'm going to pause myself here. I'm also going to put in the chat my email address. People oftentimes have questions about some of this content. So the best way to reach me is through my email, and I'm happy to to respond to those emails. And Jan was saying somebody else posted about a goal tracker app. So sorry, that wasn't directed to me. So if someone else in the room has a goal tracker app that they want to talk about, put it in the chat right now so that we can talk about that.
Dr. Lemmon, thank you so much. This presentation, it was so informative, and it feels good to know the stress is normal.
Yeah, it's normal. We all have it. I have it right now. No.
I just want to thank you again, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. This recording will be made available within the next week or so. So you can reach out to our office and also check on our website. But we will definitely have this recording made available for everyone. Again, thank you. Thank you all for coming out, and have a great rest of your evening. Dr. Lemmon, if you had anything else, if not, have a great night, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you to all. I saw some of my former students here, so thank you all for coming, and I hope to chat with you guys soon. Thanks for having me.